Little silver Corvette, baby, it's much too.
That's not silver.
This one
No,
is.
neither. No, that's gold. A and
This one?
B. Isn't the lyrics to that song about a Corvette that's a different color?
Hold on. You don't actually think that song was about a Corvette, do you?
What is it about? If not a Corvette, since it's called Little Red Corvette.
Oh, hyphen, you are so young and impressionable. The song, so here's a little insight to people who write songs and are creative geniuses. They don't actually say what they say. So Little Corvette was actually, is thought to be a reference to, how do I say this? Lady parts. Yes.
Okay.
So, and in fact, though, that's been sort of like partially debunked. I did like a little bit of research apparently, and it's like not actually like just maybe the lady parts. It's also then possibly inspired by this car that was not a Corvette, because he sang Little Red Corvette, so therefore it couldn't have possibly been around a Corvette. It was supposedly about an Edsel. So, like, then there were, like, all this sort of rumors that, like, actually the girl that he was talking about in this song, whose maybe lady parts were at whatever, had an Edsel, but then she wrote into some article and was like, correction, by the way, it was not an Edsel, it was a Mercury Marauder. So that song
It's kind of a cool car.
Yeah. But that song is either about lady parts or a Mercury Marauder. But definitely not a Corvette.
Definitely not a Corvette.
But,
okay.
But the whole idea of Little Red Corvette brings us to this episode of the Carmudgeon Show, starring that thing, that is Derek Tam-Scott, and this thing, which is me, Jason Camisa. And this week, we have something special to announce. We are supported by Amalgam, makers of amazing car models. And they have done something really cool. They have shipped us these models of Corvettes. Derek and I have conspired while the phone...
What is that, a C3?
This is a C3, and then I have a C4.
I have a C2 here.
I had a C7 somewhere. I don't know where that went.
You've misplaced a Corvette.
Well, yes.
We're 3 minutes in, and you've misplaced an entire car.
I have, as its substitute, an E30 Touring. And
Okay.
a 190 E2.316. So you'll notice something about these two cars, right? So for those of you guys listening on podcast app, I'm holding
The blue
up
one
these
is the
two.
wrong color.
Right. This is what happened. What happened was, at some point in my life, I was desperate, and I sold most of my cars, and I got down to just the Scirocco, and I moved across the country, and I was like, I can't live without my babies. So I bought a model of the cars, thinking that maybe having the model of a 2.316 on my fireplace mantle would make me stop wanting a flash silver or a smoke silver 2.316. Unfortunately, you can tell that didn't work because I now own those two cars again. But I think models are kind of an important thing. I mean, you know, we've used this Maserati model where the wheel fell off in one of the first episodes several times. If I look closely, you no longer have vodka, which means you drank it on the shelf.
The vodka's still there.
Okay, there's some vodka. But there's probably less vodka, but there are no fewer model cars. Am I right?
Yeah, there's actually more. I bought myself a Mercedes 124 wagon model.
You bought the wagon of the car that you own the sedan of? Why don't you just buy another car? I mean, you already have two 124s, don't you?
Because we talked about this in a previous episode. I need a European one with a dogleg manual. So when it's allowed to go to Europe again, I might go there and start looking under some couch cushions for a manual wagon 124.
I think you should do that.
Golf.
I think you should do that. In the meantime, I think, you know, these models will help us live vicariously through the world. But we will live vicariously through these models because we cannot go out into a world where we can drive these cars. Which is
Have you driven every flavor of Corvette?
No. I have never driven a C1. Have you driven a C1?
That's fine. I have driven a C1, yes. I do not recommend it.
Why? I mean...
Should we do this now, or should we...
I mean, look, we have nothing else to do. Well, hold
Okay.
on. First of all, let's explain this whole Amalgam thing, because Amalgam makes these models that are like... I don't want to use the term outrageously expensive. I want to use the term very valuable, because they are expensive, really well done models that aren't like, this kind of crap where the wheels fall off, when you use it in a Carmudgeon episode. They make beautiful, beautiful models of cars, and they now have a new series of all the Corvettes where they have all 8. We really thought it was actually pretty cool, and you and I have sort of differing opinions on models, so we'll fight about that in a minute. But the most important thing is there are 2 things you need to know. Number 1 is if you subscribe to the ISSIMI YouTube channel and then buy a model on the Amalgam website, you can use a coupon code that is ISSIMI, which is ISSIMI, and you get free shipping on any model anywhere in the world, which is pretty cool. But not nearly as cool as the other thing, which is a sweepstakes, is there a legal term of does it have to be a sweepstakes? Contest. There's something, whatever. Here's the deal. If you buy one of these Corvette models and you subscribe to the ISSIMI YouTube channel, you are then entered into a sweepstakes / contest / legalese something else where you can win a whole collection of all 8 of them. So all 8 generations of Corvette. And actually the grown-up in the room who's actually watching this right now, he's watching us for the first time. This is the first time we've ever been monitored by a grown-up while we're recording. And he's got a little chat window open, so I'm waiting for him to say something nasty. But
he won't say anything nasty if you don't mess anything up.
Well, the thing is, he came up with the idea that we should sign all 8 models. So you can win if you subscribe to the ISSIMI YouTube channel. You can win a signed collection. I'm like, why the fuck would we ruin someone's collection?
Less valuable if we sign them?
No one wants us to sign anything. So my thought was these things come in this amazing box. So hold on, there's sort of like this
with the other box.
Right, they come a box within a box within a box, and then they have this little pull-out thing with a card on it, and it's signed by the Amalgam guys. And I'm like, okay, well, this is pretty cool. Maybe we can sign that. So I think, came up with the idea that if anyone is lucky enough to win this full set, they should also be lucky enough to choose where and how we ruin the collection, i.e. do we sign it?
If we don't at all.
Yeah, exactly. Our grown-up is being very quiet. I have this I'm waiting for him to
He must be doing great.
I have this Charlie Brown sound effect.
Peanuts.
He just said all good.
The trumpet adult.
It's the teacher.
Yeah, the one that has no face.
Anytime he types anything on the chat window, we're just going to hear that. That's hilarious. But anyway, so most important, subscribe to the ISSIMI YouTube channel, and then go and use the ISSIMI coupon code to get free shipping, and buy one of these to enter the sweepstakes. Or, in fact, you don't even have to buy one. You can go to our website, and there'll be terms and conditions, where you can send a self-addressed stamped envelope to us and be entered in the contest to win all of this. What?
To the past. I think it should be added. One of the coolest things that Amalgam does, which is well beyond my ability to afford, is that if you spec a car or you build a car by Ferrari, for example, they will build you a model whose spec exactly matches the car you built. And so it's if you're I have matte carbon fiber here, they'll do that, and they'll match the colors of the interior and exterior and all that stuff, which is pretty swanky, but I understand that the cost of doing that is considerably more than I've paid for many of my cars. So
this is the problem. I totally want them to do my Scirocco, so I can have the Scirocco on the coffee table. In addition,
and then the model will be literally more valuable than the real car.
That's the problem. The problem isn't that the model is expensive. The problem is that I can't have the model. But what I like about these Corvettes is they're not literal copies. So this 2.316 is ridiculous. This model, I don't know who did this one. This is
Auto Art.
And the engine is perfectly detailed and whatever. These Corvettes are just, they're like a resin that's aluminized or some sort of metallic coating on them. They're all a little bit different colors. Some are more golder than others. But I like that they're sort of an interpretation of the body of this car. We talked about this offline, and this is why I said we disagree about this. Because I kind of think there is I'm going to insult you now by...
I am shocked. I'm just totally shocked.
Finally shocked, Derek. I think...
that was sarcasm.
You can't load your house with models of cars or you look like a child.
Exactly.
Even when you're 95 years old.
Let me lean over so you can see that. Oh, by the way, there's also a motorcycle in my kitchen.
Well, first of all, hold on. Having a motorcycle in your kitchen exempts you from all other criticism. Because even though I don't give a lick about motorcycles, there is nothing cooler than someone who has a motorcycle leaking oil in their kitchen. So congratulations on your kitchen and your motorcycle.
Doing that.
Yeah, I've seen it.
I mean, the point is, I'm like at one end of the spectrum, which is far away from where most people are.
Did you just tell everyone you're on the spectrum?
Yeah,
I'm just going to look
at
at
that not clear already? You're saying that as though it's some kind of newsworthy or noteworthy piece of
you do speak
information.
In beeps.
Boop, boop, beep, boop, boop, boop. Oh, now you speak my language.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here I thought,
is,
singing to you all of these episodes was speaking your language. Now I just realized I just speak in Morse code.
Yes. Point is that I like having the real thing where possible, and if I could have a car in my kitchen, then I would. But my kitchen's on the 3rd floor, so I couldn't have a car. So there's a motorcycle instead,
and a bunch of models.
And a bunch of models, yes.
But they're hidden. So what the viewers can't see is this is sort of like a corner of your kitchen. You hide the models in the corner of your kitchen. I am trashier than thou, which is why these models are typically on display on my mantle. Year-long mid-engine mistake that resulted from Enzo following a fad, the media completely misunderstanding what makes a great sports car, and a bunch of right? They're like on front line center. But I do think there's a time and place for a piece of art and a time and place for a model. And if I had a car that I had an exact model of, that goes in the garage, right? Or like the man cave. You have the model of the car and whatever else. If I had a massive model that was sitting on my dining room table, I don't think I'd want a literal model of a car. I think that's a little bit...
Too literal?
Too literal, to use a word that I used. But I don't want to say the word cheap, but you know what I mean?
Like, I get what you're saying. Like, if you're trying to get spousal approval, assuming you have a spouse, which neither of us does, then that could be a consideration. Right. But the fact of the matter is that that not having a spouse means I get to put a motorcycle in my kitchen. So
that's reason enough to be single forever. You can do whatever you want. I can put a 2.316 on my fireplace. No one can tell me otherwise.
That's right.
Yeah, but I do like bringing it back to these, and I mean genuinely, I kind of like that they're not perfect reproductions of cars, but just sort of artistic interpretations, right? Just like the little red Corvette was an artistic interpretation of perhaps something that you didn't realize it was. In your innocence,
yes,
your 94-year-old innocence.
You have enriched my understanding of the world. So thanks for that.
With useless shit, as always.
Can we talk about Corvettes for
sure.
a hot half hour or so? Okay. We started talking about the C1. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to contextualize the Corvette because there was not really an American sports car before the Corvette. I mean, let's, I guess, start with the definition. This is what I do, right? We talk about definitions. By definition, I mean, like... Otherwise, we'll get flack in the comments section, if nothing else. But also for precision. The definition of a sports car is like a vehicle used for racing, and America has not, I think in this case, when people say American sports car, when they're talking about Corvettes, I think they mean a vehicle that was used for motorsports. And so Corvettes have been used for that, for like road racing specifically, not like NASCAR, because those are not sports cars. And that's not what you use a sports car for, like NASCAR type circuit stuff. But road courses. So this would be like Corvettes. I think periodically Mustangs were used for this purpose. Cobras, if you want to call that American. It's substantially American. Or meaning, I don't know,
somewhat
meaningfully American.
Right. Mm-hmm.
What other American cars actually fit into this category? There's a precious few number of American sports cars.
I mean, you get the Daytona with the wing.
Yeah, but that was NASCAR.
Well, fair enough. Okay.
That's not like sports car racing. That's NASCAR.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. You're asking a question that I don't know the answer to because it's not my. I don't have a hard drive on that particular subject.
I mean, I don't know. A little bit in Trans Am, they ran like Mercury Capris, which are just Mustangs, I think, or something like that in the 80s. But there's not a lot of American sports cars. Correct. So in the 1950s, there's a sports car craze, which is happening as a result of this post-war, like a lot of American service members came back from the UK and brought these funny little small cars back from Europe with them, which were like MGs and stuff, which they bought for no money and drove around. And they're like, oh, this is actually kind of fun. And so sports cars started to make their way to the US, and there was kind of a craze developing for them in the 1950s. And so Chevrolet enterprisingly decided that they would make a sports car, which It kind of is. I mean, technically it is. It's just that you drive it back to back with something British, and you're like, wow, this is quite massive. And the early ones were inline sixes only, and it was kind of like a truck motor, and it was,
Sorry about the noise. I'm opening one of the C1
Oh,
Amalgam
yes.
model. I just want to kind of look at this as a reminder. The thing is, I kind of always see the C1 as the not yet fully baked, fully cemented concept of what a Corvette actually became to be known, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we would, as I love straight sixes, obviously, but we as a society would revolt if Corvette became a straight six.
Yeah, so
Right,
they were actually, the early cars were hand-built. They were only white with red interior. I think the color's called Polo White. And they had the inline six, which had a funny name. It has the word fire in it. It's like Fireball or something like that. They tried to spice up the fact that it was an inline six with some kind of name. And those cars, they are certainly a piece of history, but I think all C1 Corvettes, the other thing about these cars is that they changed a lot. I mean, there's a whole breadth of cars that fit into the C1 category, but almost every year is different. Because they had the covered headlights initially, and then they went to 2 headlights, and they went to 4 headlights, and then they put a new back end on it, which ended up being shared with the C2. But it was the same basic live axle car, which got a V8, I think, starting in 55, maybe 54. And then they sort of dropped the 6-cylinder for 56 or 57. And then, so all of those cars are called C1s, but there's actually a lot of variation because you could get like a 6-cylinder one that looked completely different from the later 8-cylinder cars, and they're all considered C1s.
Okay.
But they're united by the fact that under the skin they're all kind of the same, and they all have live suspension, live rear end.
And they were, I mean, my impression of them, having never driven one, is that they were sort of truckish and big and large and hefty compared to the European
Compared
stuff.
to European sports cars, yes,
Right.
but compared to other American cars, they were small.
Right.
And it already sets up a sort of theme for Corvettes that existed for decades, which is that they were sort of aesthetically like a sports car, and they certainly went fast, but the sort of chassis tuning was not in the same place that their competitors were. And that's very true of C2s too.
Right.
I think we talked about this when you were talking about the C2 driving experience that you had.
I mean, C2 is an interesting thing because I've only ever driven one, and it was on in back roads in northern Michigan, and I always say that cars really come into their own in their home environment, and you sort of have to experience American cars in Michigan to sort of understand why they do the things that they do. C2 was completely not what I expected. It was the small motor. It was a 351.
327.
327. Small motor.
You might have been a 350 horse. They were available in a variety of horsepower figures.
Okay. I just, all I know is, I mean, I swapped cars with a couple of guys from Haggerty, actually. We were just sort of on a drive and driving around. And I hopped into it, and my first impression was, oh my God, this is the best shifter I've ever felt in my life. And
Yes.
why
so
does
to be
no
clear,
one
you're
know?
talking about the C2, which is the Stingray,
C2,
the first
right.
Stingray.
First Stingray. And so, because I never drove, I've never sat in a C1, right? So, but C2, I got in, and why does the world use the Mazda Miatas, the NA Miata shifter as the sort of benchmark, where we say it's like the benchmark for a snick shifter? Because I think actually the C2 Corvette was better. I think it's the best shifter I've ever felt in my life. And then, I sort of put it in gear and start moving, and it doesn't really go anywhere. Sounds awesome until like 3,500, 4,000 revs, and then the thing takes off. And it was all this high rev power. I mean, not, it's obviously it's a pushrod, fairly large pushrod V8. It's not going to be revving to 8,000, 9,000 RPM. But I mean, it was happiest between, 4,000 and 5,500 at the top of its rev range. It revved instantly. It had great throttle response, and it was everything I didn't expect from a big, lumpy, dumpy American pushrod V8.
Well, it's because that's the small block.
Right. But I just assumed like that it was this big like blah, 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 American sort of muscle car motor. Nothing like that.
The big blocks are like that.
Okay.
The big block is one of those cars where if you're sitting in it and in neutral, stopped, and you rev it, you think the car's going to roll over, which is kind of why it's one of my greatest guilty pleasures is a big block C2 Corvette. I have some great video clips of miscellaneous C2 experiences that I've had. Which
I would like to hear that.
It's really pretty neat.
Okay. We'll watch it. You can dig for all those inserts after this episode. Ding.
I will do so with near pleasure.
I will say I think I know why that's probably such a pleasure. It's because the engine then becomes an outrageous source of giggles, but the chassis of the C2 is possibly the worst car I've ever driven.
Yeah, they're not great. The steering also is hilariously like low geared because the
48
power steering
turns.
is optional. And so the car has to be able to be turned without power steering. And so the number of turns is comedic. A lot of vintage American cars are like this. A lot of probably vintage cars generally are like this. If you don't have power steering, you put a large steering wheel and give a lot of turns lock to lock so that a person with like arms can operate it.
But I think that most places sort of most car companies were in geographic locations where they struck a balance between you need some muscle to turn the wheel, but you also then need to be able to get the thing around a corner. And again, place where the car was conceived, Michigan doesn't have twisty roads. So holy shit, to keep it in a straight line, you were doing 90-degree adjustments in the steering wheel just to keep it.
Yes.
And then there's the issue of the fact
was
that
it on bias ply tires?
Yes.
Because that is another feature of bias ply tires, which enhances that sensation of sort of aquatic vagueness.
The front, I just remember getting out of the car and saying the front and rear of suspensions of this car are not actually on the same chassis. Like they're not attached in any way. This car goes wherever the hell it wants. It is throw it into like a 90-degree corner when you're making a right-hand turn or something, and you have no idea what the hell's going to happen. And it was one of the worst driving cars I've ever driven, and that's with a little asterisk saying that I like bad cars because they have charm. But this was just not particularly great. And so I think the reason you like the big blocks is because the hilarity of the engine would make up for that and just turn it into a muscle car that it doesn't matter if it turns, it doesn't matter if you go. But the small engine with that amazing shifter and the high rev power, I'm like, oh my God, we're 2/3 of a way to a sports car. Oh, but they forgot to put the engine in a sports car.
Yeah.
Well, I'm driving a tractor.
Was it a fuel-injected one or a carbureted one?
I think it was carbureted.
So
carbureted.
in 1957, Corvettes were made available with fuel injection.
All right, now I got to look at my spreadsheet. Keep going.
And fuel injection was mechanical fuel injection, and that was offered until 65. And then they were like, oh, actually, we'll have a big block instead, and we'll just have increased horsepower by putting a big block in it. So in 65 was the only year you could get a big block or fuel injection. And I think fuel injection might have cost more than a big block, so nobody bought it in 65. Incidentally, 65 was also the first year of disc brakes. So like a 65 with disc brakes and fuel injection is kind of like a holy... it's not a holy grail, but it's a one-year special kind of thing. That's kind of a neat, interesting car. But then Corvettes did not become fuel-injected again until the C4 came out in 83?
That's pretty crazy. That's a long time to sort of
Yeah, so between
course.
66 and 83, 4, whatever it was, there were no fuel-injected Corvettes available. But it was one of the first American cars available with fuel injection, which you could also get that engine in like a Bel Air or something, in the 327 Fuelie. So that, but then, you know, there were 396 big blocks, and then those became 427s, and those are the sort of the late Stingray cars that give all the magical, especially with like side pipes and knockoff wheels and all the sort of goodies that make it maximum 1960s, and those are
maximum
really,
American 1960s,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing is when Corvette is closest to what it should be, you know, which is an American car, it's an American interpretation of a sports car, then I think it's always going to be better.
Mm-hmm.
Have you driven a C3?
I've never driven a C3, any C3.
Me neither.
But I understand that initially, like when the C3 first came out in '68, you could still get a big block, and still had chrome bumpers, and it was still very much the swinging '60s, and they had, you know, were really pretty full fat. And then, of course, by the time the emissions regulations start arriving, I think they went from like 400. In '67, the max horsepower I think was 425, and then or 435, excuse me. 425 and 66, 35 and 67, if memory serves. In any case, they were still like powerful, but then they were down to like 190 horsepower or something terrible like that in the 70s, which is sort of representative of all the malaise stuff as people are trying to figure out how to deal with emissions. And then they put plastic front and rear ends on them too, which is sort of a regrettable aesthetic choice.
I got to say, of all of the early Corvettes, I mean, Stingray is beautiful, but C3s make me weak. And I think it's just a...
Early C3s.
Yeah, and I think it's just when I came online as a car enthusiast, was pre-C4, and there was just something curvaceously swoopy about a C3 that sort of reminded me of the Ferrari stuff and just the really exotic stuff, but just trashy enough and just curvaceous enough, and... Have you seen the door handles? The door handles on that car are pretty cool too. I don't think I noticed.
It's on the top of the door. There's a little metal oval that's flush with the top of the door, and you just push down on it, and that's what opens the door. It's a pretty trick.
Pretty cool.
Speaking of esoteric information that will serve you well in your life going forward, you're welcome. So I've never driven a C3. I don't know what they're like, but I imagine it'll feel fairly familiar to a C2, I'm guessing.
Right.
I don't know.
And C4 was a big change. C4 was...
Yes, fuel injection.
Fuel injection.
Possibly electronic fuel injection.
I think it said EFI on the back.
Tuned port injection.
Tuned port or throttle body. I mean, but yeah, they had all kinds of different badges on them. But C4 was another one that was great looking. A friend of mine just recently had a white C4 convertible with a red leather interior. And man, is that car good looking.
Did you operate it?
I did. I drove it a total of about a mile and a half, diagnosing a hideous clunk in the rear. Which
was it the body separating from the chassis?
No, that's what it sounded like. It wasn't quite as full sound metal as I expected it to be. And then
they're made of plastic.
Plastic, right, exactly. But it wound up, it was a bad axle. But it was, my impression was sort of like, absolutely 10 out of 10 in the looks department. And then even the interior was just spectacular. I love that GM went so far as to style the traction control button on those cars so that instead of just a standard traction, we'll find an insert, a traction control button, the button itself was looking at the back of a Corvette laying like skid marks. Like just really well thought out, great looking stuff. Until you touched it.
Fabulous 80s LED setup too.
There was a digital dash option. I think this one, if I remember correctly, was a non-digital with these massive needles on it. They're like a 14-foot long sweep.
Yes.
But the overwhelming experience that I had was long-legged. Like the car was just not.
Was it
quick.
A 4-speed? Because those cars were were 4 speeds. The manual was it an automatic?
What? No, it was a manual. It was a 5-speed, 5 or 6. It was 5-speed.
I think you could get C4s with 4-speed manuals, which is kind of a throwback. And then, of course, 6 speeds in the ZR1. The ZR1 was quite a big deal when it came out.
The ZR1 was
4 times as many camshafts as a Corvette normally has.
Yeah. So one way.
So the big deal was that it was a 32-valve dual overhead cam motor, which was a Lotus-designed motor, I think.
Lotus-designed and Mercury machine-built.
Mercury Marine in Fond du Lac. Fond du Lac, I don't know if they were built at Fond du Lac, but there's a town in Wisconsin called Fond du Lac.
Is there a church in that town? Catholic church by any chance? With priests?
Oh.
That's a really bad, inappropriate joke. How dare you, Jason?
This is how they refer to the town. Like, they don't even say anything. People who are there, they just do this.
There we go. I'm getting yelled at. Look at the chat screen. Teacher says, I'm in big trouble.
Stay on task.
Teacher just smashed me with a ruler. Don't you dare make fondle jokes. Sorry, it's too easy not to. Sorry to interrupt your train of thought.
ZR1.
ZR1.
6-speed transmission.
ZR1
so more camshafts, more valves, and more gears in the transmission.
Let's remember one thing, though. There has not before or since been another overhead cam Corvette, right? Nothing since. Everything else is pushrod. Nothing else is, yes. There's still pushrod. For the moment. For the moment, because there's definitely a quad cam V8 coming I shouldn't say definitely. It's sort of an agreed upon prediction for the C8, but we'll get to the C8 in a second. But there has never been more than another. I mean, even like C7s they're all push rods.
That's cool. And so 6 speeds, kind of a big deal then also. I think possibly. Porsche 959 was technically 6 speeds, although the first gear is marked G. Right. And second gear is marked 1. But
Corvette was a full real 6-speed. Car and Driver had if I remember correctly, it was Car and Driver that had it on the cover as the Corvette From Hell. And I remember reading all these letters like, you can't use language like that, and people were really upset. But that car was
far we've come as a society.
405 horsepower, 410 horsepower, 410.
I thought it was 405, but I'm also far from a Corvette expert.
Shit ton of horsepower. It doesn't matter. I mean, for
the early 90s, yeah.
I remember studying the torque curve of that engine because I couldn't believe they were able to get that much horsepower out of an engine, that quote unquote small. At that point we had transitioned from the gross horsepower measurement system from the 1960s and 70s into net horsepower. So even though the 60s cars had 400 horsepower gross, that wasn't the equivalent of today's 400 horsepower. That was horsepower measured at the crank while the engine was out on a stand, and it didn't necessarily have to have any accessories on it. So it didn't have a water pump necessarily, didn't need to have a power steering pump. Air conditioning. Didn't even need to have exhaust headers. Like it could just be whatever it needed to be. And the sort of SAE net horsepower numbers that we see today or the SAE certified, or all of them, they're installed in the car or run exactly as they're installed in the car with that intake system, with all the accessories and ancillary drives, with air conditioning on and all the other shit.
So have you driven a ZR1?
No. And the craziest thing to me is that they're cheap.
They're super cheap. Like a spectacular low mileage one is like 25 grand or something like that.
How precisely?
They must drive terribly.
The regular C4 I drove didn't. I mean, wasn't
someone I was talking to? It might have been one of the Radwood guys, in fact, because they had a red one, I think, circulating among them. And I heard that it was not very good to drive, but I don't remember why.
They're truckish, they're long-legged, they're kind of crappy interior-wise. I mean, they were definitely not...
Speaking of crappy interiors, C5.
I don't have too much experience with C5.
Have you ever sat in one and looked at the radio and the switches and everything? It's straight out of like a contemporary Malibu or like a Silverado pickup truck. Like the switchgear is so low rent.
Okay, so compare and contrast with the C4 with the ESP button, the stability control button. Although the rest of the interior was just crap GM stuff that just fell apart, whatever. And this was always the problem with Corvette, is even when they got the performance stuff right, like with the ZR1, the build quality wasn't there and the tactile stuff wasn't there.
Well, and that's why the cars cost like half as much. I mean, like I remember in my automotive coming of age era was probably the late 90s, and you would look at like a 365 horsepower base C5 against a Boxster, and a Boxster has, like more than 100, Boxster S, which has more than 100 fewer horsepower and costs $15,000 more. Right. And so people are like, why would you ever buy a Porsche, blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, well, I don't know. Actually, Boxster's not a good example of good interior quality.
No, not that. But the intangibles were completely different. I mean...
Well, in terms of the chassis dynamics and the braking performance and the sort of agility
the whole
of the
experience, car. Right? The experience of a Corvette was always a very, very, very different thing than... they were heavy. So, I mean, I really sort of started driving Corvettes at C6. And everything was heavy, and the car was intimidating, and they were...
unwieldy, felt unwieldy.
Yeah, and big and burly. And I bring this up because it's important when we get to C8. But C6 was an intimidating car to drive until you really started pushing it. And then it actually was pretty okay. I remember was it a Z06 I think I had on a racetrack that I just had a fast lap for automobile, and I was scared to death of this car, and then I got in it. And the only real issue was that the gas pedal was sprung so softly that and it had very stiff suspension, and that going over bumps, I would actually add throttle and then cause a slide that I didn't want, and then I would be like, yeah, because you're sitting so far back, and the car was a little bit scary to manage. But other than that, they were not bad. They were like actually good cars.
When they finally started
Dynamic.
making the cars able to dance, because
Right.
I think that wasn't true of the C4. I don't know if that's true about the C5. I know the Z06, when the C5 first came out, was kind of a big deal, because they're like, we're finally making a Corvette that,
Right.
And of course, they dusted off the Z06 name from the 1960s. This is one of those classic examples of 1960s cars where there's like, they all look the same, but for some reason this one's worth $1 million and that one's worth 50 grand. But that was always the deal with the Z06s. The Corvette guys of that early Corvettes are some of the most rabid car enthusiasts, like as rabid, if not more rabid than Porsche guys, which is saying a lot because Porsche guys are super nerdy. But they're like, does it have the tank sticker, which is like an actual sticker that was applied to the fuel tank when the car was built that lists all the options on it and stuff. And they're like, this is how you tell if this has been, like, you're looking for the bond lines on the inside of the fenders to tell if blah, blah, blah. And like, they're really nerdy about authenticating cars and judging them in Concours and stuff. It's something. I don't know.
It's cool because it means people care enough, right? That stuff doesn't happen when no one cares. So if anyone is passionate about any car, I don't judge them publicly. Kidding. No, I mean, we all have different flavors. And by the way, back to that whole Michigan thing, what works there doesn't work in other places. We know that. You're not going to take a C2 to Europe and compare it to a European sports car, or a C5 for that matter. But when I moved to Michigan, I had these two cars among a bunch of other stuff, and I sold them all, and because I hated them there. They didn't work. So, if you live in a place where the roads are big, straight, wide open, these cars are pretty magic, I can imagine. Something with a big V8 and great looks and a cool experience. Long legs, just smooth ride. Why not? My understanding of the first Z06 was that it wasn't particularly light and dainty and talkative, but it just definitely laid down the numbers. And then by the time they got to C6... You're
talking about the C5 Z06.
C5
not
Z06,
the first, which would be
True, I'm sorry.
two.
Yep, the C5, the resurrected Z06 name. And by the time they got to C6, it got a little bit better. I mean, that car wasn't exactly light and dainty, but it was very surprising to me to realize that it was the same basic size as a 911 of its time. And, it was a bit wider, but they were not huge. They sort of have this... Corvettes...
Well, 911 got huge also.
That's true. But back then it wasn't. I mean, I guess 996 was out. I guess it is a lot bigger than early 911.
They're cool cars, yeah.
But yeah, I just always remember being shocked at how quote-unquote little the Corvette was because it drove so big. And then C7
Which is kind of the opposite of what you want with a sports car.
It's the opposite of what I want, for sure. I mean, again, look at where we live. We live in a place where roads are tiny and twisty, and we drive stupid little things like Lotuses and what's your smallest car? Yeah.
What is my smallest car? Miata.
Yeah, Miatas, exactly. I mean, you couldn't fit like a 70s Cadillac in my neighborhood. Like it would just get stuck between two redwoods or something. It just doesn't work. But I drove a bunch of different variations of C6. And I remember the ZR1, I wish I had this on video. We had an office manager at Automobile Magazine. We were doing an annual All-Stars thing, and the ZR1 came out, and this was like, the supercharged. It was not like the original one with the 90s one with a 4-cam. It was just supercharged, insane motor. And GM makes the best, you're going to kill me for saying this, best sounding V8s on the planet, period. And that thing had a shriek unlike anything I'd ever heard before. And we get our office manager in, who was like probably 20 years older than I was, so she was probably in her 50s. She was really fun. She's very Detroit in this, like she's kind of gruff and no bullshit. And I adored her for this. Like everyone else in the office was nice, and she'd call me and she'd be like, "Fuck you, Camisa, for doing this." And so I'm like, "Come on, take a ride in this car with me." And she had been in a bunch of quick cars over the week, and we were on this highway in like Ohio or something, and it was the very beginning of a new highway. So you merge on, and there's nobody around, and there's 2 lanes, and I floored it. And she started screaming and punching me and like, I mean, freaking out. The things that came out of her mouth had me laughing for about 2 years. I mean, I have the filthiest mouth of anyone I know. I couldn't, in good conscience, repeat half of what she said. She called me every name in the book. And afterwards, she like lit a cigarette and she was like, "That was more intense than an orgasm. Holy shit." That's the power of like a ZR1. or like a Corvette. That's what it should do. It didn't even matter. It didn't have to be fast. The noise and the whole experience of what the hell just happened. Of course, we were sideways because they couldn't put the power down.
I mean, this is a lot like driving a big block vintage Corvette also.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, I've got, I guess, nominally disc brakes, I suppose.
They were technically nominaled. They were named discs.
Yeah.
Whether they functioned as such is a different story. And then C7 came out. And have you driven C7?
I drove one C7 ZR1.
Oh, so another slow one.
Yes.
What was
it was a spicy meatball.
Hold on, I've just received a message from the adult. I have to get the official adult soundtrack because this is too funny not to. Okay, he asks us to. He said Derek is a Carmudgeon. Okay. Yes, he's requesting that we show models, and he's right because we're idiots.
You've got one right here. Wait, I'm getting a C7.
Okay, so you get the C7. So you drove a C7. Mm-hmm. Tell me about
ZR1.
it. ZR1.
It was a spicy meatball.
The spicy meatball.
Yes.
Just in terms of speed,
I might have pooped.
I have the C7 here. This one's got a bluish coat to it.
The one that I drove was kind of a blue-gray. It was a very lovely color. And it had like a creamy, like tan interior. It was actually quite sophisticated. And the thing that most surprised me, besides the surprise poop, was the interior quality was like actually really spectacular. And I don't think I spent time in a C6, but I'd spent a fair amount of time in the C5. And like the C5 interior, I just could not take the car seriously because of the interior. And then the C7 interior is like, holy crap, this is like genuinely a pleasure like to be in. And it's, I don't know.
We had
compared
big disagreements.
To a C5.
Oh yeah, that's the thing is we had big disagreements in the office. I remember because the sort of like Detroit rah-rah guys were like, this is 911 quality, and I'm like, yeah, maybe 996. But by the standards of every other Corvette, it was a quantum leap. By the standard of every other $100,000 sports car, it was acceptable.
Well, yes, and Corvettes mentally to me are still $50,000 cars base price. But I guess yes,
and they are. I mean, that's the thing is they're at the end of the day they're cheap. I mean, and they're inexpensive cars. They start out far below the price of a 911, for example. And even though you can option them up to $100 and something thousand, they're at the end of the day the cheap ones have to be made cheaply. But I love my first. I was reading this before, so I have my my spreadsheet of all the cars I've ever driven, and this was actually a C6 Corvette T-top, brutally raw but kind of cool. My penis feels huge.
And that's it.
And that's it. And that was
the end of your notes.
I mean, but C7 was the same way, gave you that same exact feeling of enormous masculinity, but with a quality interior and actually a driving experience that was genuinely as good, different, but as good as all the real sports cars in the world. And that was the first time I've driven, C7 was the first time I've driven any Corvette that actually was a reasonable player on the world stage. I remember,
Finally.
And it was like, they're this sort of like weird GMisms, like whatever starter GM uses on the small block feels like always sounds like you have a dead battery. It can barely turn the motor over, especially when they're hot. So you get in and you hit the button and it's like, wow, and it starts. And in the morning on the C7, they were direct injection. They would crank for like 15 or 20 or 30 compression strokes. And I remember talking to an engineer and he said, it's for emissions. We want to make sure we get stable compression before we inject the first bit of fuel, because one misfire can, cause an entire failed emissions test. And I'm talking about like the federal emissions test. So you would get in it and be like, wow, and it would start. And you're like, what the fuck is wrong with this thing? And then they idle even when they're warm and it's a constant misfire. And then you realize it's a pushrod, cam in block, 2 valve per cylinder engine from 1761. And they've somehow given this thing variable valve timing and direct injection, and they've brought it into the 1900s and then into the 2000s. And I'm sure it misfires all the time. I can't imagine how big the catalytic converter has to be on this thing to get past emission standards. But they sit and they misfire and they shake, and that is so 100% part of the Corvette experience, and I love that. Once you get
Yes,
past...
it gives you this sort of sense of texture. To me, it's one of those cars, together with like an Aston Martin V8 or V12 Vantage and like the 911 GT3 Touring, which has these sort of ingredients of an old-fashioned like car that has somehow been modernized and is still available for sale. And there's not a lot of those types of cars left.
You're right. You're right. I mean, how many other... Does anyone in the world... Hold on, I have to say that. Does anyone in the world make an engine with push rods in it other than the Americans?
Other than GM? You mean for non-lawnmower applications?
Yeah.
Or like
Does
industrial?
my lawnmower might have like quad cams and no. Don't forget the Hemi. The Hemi's also a push rod motor from 1841. But yeah, I think we're kind of the only ones left.
Who are using push rods?
And frankly, the whole like
cars.
in the 1980s when I was a mere pup. Oh wow! Did you see the C5 model? It's like vibrantly green. I don't know.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, I hadn't opened that one yet. Sort of the forgotten generation of Corvettes. I don't know, gold and green. When I was a mere pup in the 1980s, we were making fun of like GM's pushrod motors, like these stupid idiots. Meanwhile, the Mercedes and the Volkswagens and
everyone's doing dual overhead cams and putting it on the outside of their car because it's so important.
Yeah, in the early 80s, like 4 valves per cylinder was like a massive, massive thing. Like that was like the thing to do.
Yeah,
and these guys everything still had push rods. And the joke is, the great irony is, we were wrong, because 40 years later, the small block is kind of the best sounding V8 on the planet. I know I'm going to get shit for that, but if anyone just go drive a Corvette Z06. Just drive one. You will shut up when you hear that exhaust note. Inside the car, outside the car, it's authentic, it's real. There's mechanical noise, intake noise, and exhaust noise. The exhaust noise is trumpets screaming out the back of the car, 4 of them. It echoes off of everything, and you get in that, and you get into something like that. I have an AMG GT outside, and worst case, last week I had a Aston Martin V8 Vantage with that same 4-liter. It sounds like ass, especially in the Aston. It sounds absolutely terrible, and I think, how is it that this pushrod V8 sounds like the best orchestra in the world, perfectly toned orchestra, like trying to explode your eardrums, and the best the Germans can come up with is the world has gone in the wrong direction. Sorry.
You're very curmudgeonly today.
I was going to say, I'm very good. Wait, I haven't started to be curmudgeonly yet because I need to unbox the C8.
Oh, so we can talk about the C8 and what a joy that car is.
How do you fuck up a mid-engine car? So anyway, C8, looks-wise, what do you think?
I stand by this statement. I said this statement when I first saw the C8. What the C8 looks like to me is it looks like a car from a Meguiar's package where they didn't want to license a real car. And so they were like, let's just like create a sports car and put it on the package, but it's not actually a real car.
I'll be honest with you. The Amalgam model looks way better. This like artistic reinterpretation where 3/4 of the details of the car are left out and smoothed over and metallicized looks so much better than the car in reality. I saw a picture in this morning, and I will try to steal it on Instagram, that someone posted of a black C8, and it had black with like black wheels, and it was lowered, and the thing looked magic. It looked absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, so it has the right proportions and shapes, but if you look closely at the detailing and the sort of like specifics of the car, you're like, well, this is a little excessively busy and incoherent, and like appears to have come from the desk of a 14-year-old.
There's definitely a taste level missing with C8, but of course I
thought the C7 was generally quite good looking.
It was.
There's a few things I would have liked cleaned up, but generally the rear lights especially.
Exhaust,
exactly.
Too many exhausts, too many pipes. I agree. I think that there are two types of people in the world when they look at cars. The people who just see proportions, and the people who see details.
Forms, yeah. Right. Proportions and forms.
And this is that Aston Martin V8 Vantage, the current V8 Vantage. The proportions are unbelievable. They're perfect, and the details are horrid. And so that's like the greatest example of a car that if you love it or you hate it, and if you love it, it's because you're looking at the proportions, and if you hate it, it's because you're looking at the details. C8 is nowhere near that polarizing. C8's proportions are almost perfect. The rear end's a little bit too long. It's like a elongated rear section. But when you see one from straight on, or from front or back, it's really wide, really low, looks very aggressive. There are some great lines and great angles on the car, but overall, I think it falls a little bit short of other things that are mid-engined. But here's my problem with C8 overall. I've been very hard on the car and press about its understeer and handling and whatever else. All of that can be fixed. The fundamentals of a Corvette to me are missing. So you get in a C8 and you start it and you get that same old small block experience. It still cranks slowly, it cranks too long, it then misfires even once it's warmed up, and you kind of get this shaking thing and you're like, okay, I'm in a Corvette. And then you grab the steering and it's like super light and super quick. And then the transmission is really well programmed to be a very precise thing. Like, we've all driven Porsche PDKs and they're like the most precise thing in the world. It's it responds instantly and almost in a sterile sort of computer synthetic way. And the C8 does that. As soon as you're moving, you hear engine noise that's coming from the doors. And more importantly, the speakers in the doors. You don't need that. The small block is the best sounding V8 in the world. So it's a synthetic acoustic experience, partially. And then you get this synthetic perfection of gear shifts and a lightness of controls. The steering is super light. The shift paddles even are super light. I mean, there should be a fucking manual, but that just goes without saying. Even the brake effort, everything about the car went light. And I think C1, if I see all of these models in front of me, and reminding of everyone I've ever driven, they're long-legged, heavy-handed, slow, heavy steering. The shifter on a C7, you could break your wrist. I mean, you needs a lot of force. And there's this driveline lash. So the car is kind of like, the engine doesn't rev up quickly, and then when it does, you get a driveline lash buck. All of that has been taken completely out of the C8, and it's now, for the first time since the C2, a very different thing. And I don't like when car companies change what I expect. And that's what makes me a Carmudgeon.
Mm-hmm. So it is objectively good, but it has lost some of the character and texture that previously defined the franchise.
Yeah, it is objectively good. It is objectively not great, but look, the reason that Chevy went to the mid-engine layout is very simple. Once you put an engine in the middle of a rear-wheel drive sports car, you have the front axle left to play with, and you can put electric motors there. And you can do what Acura set out to do with the NSX, which was to do a mid-engine rear drive car with front axle torque vectoring. And torque vectoring basically can be used to clean up limit handling so that mid-engine cars tend to want to understeer, and the C8 does that too. Porsche has figured out ways to mostly make the 718 cars never understeer. Sometimes they do, most of the time they don't. But when you get into an understeer situation in a mid-engine car, if you have torque vectoring in the front, you can fix it. Or if you get into an oversteer situation where you're not going to be able to turn quickly enough to catch it, well, the torque vectoring can fix it. And that is the real benefit of the mid-engine layout, why Chevy did that. What they also did, because they're very great engineers, is they took advantage of the traction advantages inherent in having the engine in the back, and they went from this really long-legged, long gearing philosophy, which they needed.
Otherwise you would be roasting the tires constantly.
Which you do, and even C7, like a base Corvette, will lay rubber all the way through 50 miles an hour in first gear, and then shift in a second, and it'll keep laying more. But the C8 has vastly more traction. So now it's got this obscenely short gear ratios, first, second, third, which is exactly what Porsche has done, why their PDK cars are just brutally, obscenely fast in instrumented tests. Corvette did that. They lopped a second off the 0 to 60 with no more power. The C8 actually weighs more than the C7 did and has effectively no additional power. So power to weight remains effectively identical. And they went from high 3s to high 2s on 0 to 60 from the traction advantage and short gears. And that's just great engineering. Like, that's brilliant engineering. Unfortunately, the car doesn't want to turn, so they understeer terminally. And unfortunately, they changed the whole philosophy of it. This, PDK, fake noises and perfect transmissions, not what I expect. Especially when it looks as gruff as the C8 does. Because it also has that sort of tough
visual
guy.
Brutality.
God, you have such a way of putting things with words. You should be a writer. I was just going to say
Isn't
it's trashy.
that your job?
Yeah, but I was going to say it's trashy. I like to put value judgments on things. Visual brutality is a non-value judgment. Trashy
diplomatic.
Right. Well, didn't you go to school for civil something? You learned how to be
engineering. That's not what you do as a civil engineer. Nobody knows what civil engineers do. They make roads and bridges and buildings and like the built environment, airport runways, stuff like that, dams.
Damn
it. So the question is, where does the C8 go from here? Because so far we've only gotten one flavor of C8, and the question is theoretical. I mean, GM has obviously demonstrated their ability to brilliantly tune chassis. And we've only gotten the base model car, and obviously there's probably a lot more batshit stuff up the pipeline coming, and it could be potentially magical.
It will be magical, and I have the ultimate faith. So one of the GM engineers that I was talking to when I drove the C8 I'm not going to get in trouble, but said he did not disagree with my observations about the terminal understeer, and that's frankly, you can watch the road and track video. Where my boss there, Travis, set a lap time, and you watch the car just terminally understeer around every corner on the track. He went to a certain steering angle, would dial a little bit more and stay there, and you just heard, whereas every other car, you'd see him pull out steering every time the back started to move around, or he'd turn in and then pull out. So it's visible, unquestionable, undeniable understeer that, I'm sorry if you've read a review that someone says the car doesn't understeer, they're fucking wrong. Just go look with your own eyes. Even their chassis guy admitted that it wasn't perfect. Let's put it that way.
It's tuned for safety. Of course, snap oversteer
Bullshit. Then, so the last Corvette. So here's, GM has, together with Porsche and Ferrari, they are at the absolute top of the best chassis tuners in the business. They know how to make a car, and they have proven it time and time again, neutral under almost all circumstances. And they will not tell me what the recipe is, but I know what the dish is, and the dish is neutral at all times. I know that they use steering, magnetorheological shocks, the differential, and probably brakes, even though they say they don't, to change the car's behavior so that no matter what you do in, for example, an ATS-V, no matter what you do, the car's not going to plow forward understeering. You start to understeer, you put more steering in, the car turns. That violates the laws of physics. If you're understeering and you add more steering, you're just going to plow more. The back end responds. So they're doing something in all of these cars. And I don't want to say admitted because it sounds like there's a culpability there. They said that they were not able to perform the same tricks on the C8 as they've done on their other cars. And there are a bunch of reasons that have to do with mass and tires, and they didn't want to go into details, and I don't want to go into detail. But I know those guys. I've seen their work. I know that car will be made to be brilliant, and I also know that if anyone can get that mid-engine rear-wheel drive front axle torque vectoring sports car recipe to work, it's Ferrari and GM. And those are the two companies that are working on it right now. We have the Ferrari hybrid that's coming and the C8 hybrid, and that is going to, mark my words, change your expectations for handling, and it will change the world.
Honda, on the other hand.
Oh, sorry, that hurt. I mean, Honda has a history of pulling off the most amazing engineering stunts in the world, including, do you know the story about them putting CVCC on a small block? Oh, no. God, I should have done this research. So in the late 1970s, Honda was petitioning the United States, I guess it would have been mid-70s, petitioning the EPA to not require catalytic converters on their cars, and demonstrated that their cars could pass U.S. emission standards without a catalytic converter at all. Volkswagen did this too. Volkswagen's cars were exempted for a couple of years from CATs because they could pass without. And it was just great engineering that got them to be clean enough. And I wish we could pause this setting and do research, but I'm ripping out old memory banks. GM fought them and said, this is bullshit. How dare you come into our country and tell us what to do? This is America. And Honda himself went and put CVCC heads on, which is compound Well, what did CVCC stand for? You should know this. Beep, boop, 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 boop. Compound combustion vortices, some weird shit. Anyway, this was their head design that was very, very clean. And they put CVCC heads on, I think it was a small block, and showed that that small block could pass U.S. emissions regulations without a catalytic converter. And that shut everyone up. This is the company that could always pull off the impossible. And the NSX just didn't. Everyone has a bad day. Everyone misses the targets. Some of the NSX's targets were just silly, like, all-weather performance and things that just aren't really important to people who have a $200,000 mid-engine sports car. Like, how well does it do in puddles? And, how usable is it every day, even though they forgot to put any sort of interior storage in it whatsoever. And I think they were working on a bunch of compromises and internal fights and stuff like that. If Honda fucked it up, the only two companies that I think could fix it chassis-wise are GM and Ferrari, and they will. All right, mark my words, they will. One way or another, that C8 will be great. But yeah,
will be.
It's not great. It's good. It's a good car. It's good. It's a great, a great message to the world. Watch what's coming. But it's not a great car dynamically yet. And I don't think it's a great Corvette in terms of, the visceral, my penis feels enormous.
Hey, look at the first person to use visceral this episode was you instead of me.
Yep.
But yes, I get.
But then I followed it up by the word penis, so it's fine. I mean, it's a visceral, my penis feels enormous experience. I will say what the C8 does do better than just about any Corvette I've ever driven is make people stop and run over and take pictures of it. So whether we like the design language and the styling details or not, clearly it's a success in that department.
Well, that's very democratic. That's sort of Corvette's vibe.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what, you, Mr. Miata driving, motorcycle in your garage, car models on the world, from all around the world on your shelf behind you, and me, Mr. Lotus driving San Francisco, back road idiot. It doesn't matter what we think.
Corvette, we're not Corvette buyers.
We're not. I've considered it. I considered a C5 and wound up buying my 996. But they are now closer. I feel like C7 was closer than ever. I feel like a bunch of car guys that I know that are former Porsche and BMW M guys have purchased Corvettes.
My brother almost bought a C7.
A hyphen? A hyphen in a Corvette? How does
he bought a GT350R instead.
Oh, that's right. After my video on it, right? He blamed me at some point. I don't know if that was like a revisionist history thing, but he's like, "Yeah, you cost me all this money. I bought a GT350R."
Yeah, it's the only American car that anyone in my family has owned in the last 30 years.
That's a hell of a car. That's a car that Ford got 100% right.
Except for the power steering pump.
Well, okay, 99 point, something percent right. What Derek is talking about is that I wrecked one, because Derek's an asshole. Thank you very much. The GT500.
But at least what I also said was that it wasn't your fault.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're totally right. Definitely wasn't my fault that I wrecked the car.
That it was an engineering shortcoming.
Those cars do have a very weak, which is rectified now on the GT500 and retrofitted to the GT350s. They have a relatively weak power steering, electric power steering assist motor. And if you get in the middle of a tank slapper and a slide, it will run out of boost, and you can't correct fast enough. In fact, I don't think I was really able to turn the wheel at all. I just remember, and just spinning off the track backwards into a tire wall, and bending a little bit of metal and scuffing up the car to the point where I had to go and get a buffer that night from AutoZone and buff the skid marks off the side of the car because I had a tire wall. Anyway, yes, they got that car 99.9% right. And now, by the way, they put the updated GT500 steering rack in the GT350, and it lost all its power steering, its on-center steering feel. So, I don't want to say that Ford got it wrong, because they prioritized steering feel over this ridiculous fringe case of Camisa on our compounds on, Chuckwalla Raceway, sliding a car when he shouldn't have been, and then crashing it. So let me be democratic about that and civil and say it's not entirely Ford's fault that I'm that crashed the car.
Mm-hmm.
Because they made a choice. Anyway, all right. So what we'll do is we'll insert some inserts of these amalgam models. They do come in. Do you have a full box? I mean, the crazy thing is how many boxes. So this is the C6 sculpture. I will do an unboxing video right here. So it does actually come in a very tight-fitting box. Once you open the main box, Derek, you're probably laughing. I can't even see you. There is another box. Which is actually a slidey off thing. You slide this to open it. This is a C6 sculpt. In here is the model in a bag, which then comes off. There is the C6 model. That's really gold. And then there's the pamphlet with the signatures on it. So whoever it is that goes to amalgamcollection.com and buys one of these using our ISSIMI coupon code and also subscribes to the YouTube channel and is then entered into the contest will win all of these, and you can tell us where you want to sign it, where you want us to sign it, including nowhere. Because
yes. And if you want to have a car, like I would love to see an amalgam model built of some car whose value is virtually zero, just because I think the improbability of it would be really cool.
Well, we should do that. Like in the comments, why don't you guys like put like what would be the most hilarious like $20,000 amazing amalgam model?
Yes.
Like is it like a
for like one of those 4-wheel drive Tercels station wagons?
Why do you keep bringing that up? God, you're so.
I don't know.
mean.
I just think that it would be really improbable.
Uh-oh, we're being yelled at. He says Scirocco.
Not. You made that up.
Yeah,
you were
totally
completely
did.
fabricating revisionist history.
Oh no, hold on. Right. Oh no, he did just talk. Hold on, wait, no, he actually did, and he said the bitch basket.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so we could have the.
I wanted to have
the bitch basket.
I wanted to have a functioning heated rear window.
This is the. I cannot believe that the only grown up in the room refers to one of my cars as the bitch basket. He didn't say your 1988 Volkswagen Cabriolet or like your Mark I Cabby or the bitch basket.
That is the only appropriate terminology.
Right. So if anyone at Amalgam, if you're listening, you can make an Audi wagon with smoke coming out the back. Grown up is a bitch.
That was a very traumatic experience.
Apparently, grown-up teacher boy is a sarcastic, evil motherfucker. I like him a lot better. Who knew grown-ups could be fun? All right, to everyone watching, I apologize for the weird video thing if I'm looking not at the camera this time. It's only because I was looking out for comments from the grown-up in the room. And so Derek is there. And if I move him over, now he's here. It's very weird. Technical difficulties. But don't forget to check out the collection of amalgam models because they really do make some like crazy awesome stuff. Enter the contest to win these and tell us, if you do, where you want us to sign it or where you want us to shove it.
Wow. And don't forget to like and subscribe and return next week for additional complaining about whatever is actually good.
Everything. If you enjoyed the Carmudgeon Show, make sure you subscribe to the ISSIMI YouTube channel and click that notification bell to make sure you're told every time we publish something amazing, which is basically every time we publish anything. Are we done yet?